Hello, I'm really sorry I can't be there with you today, but instead I'm going to bring you all to the west of Ireland to have a look at turloughs, which are very common around where I live. Turlough is an Irish word, you know the name loch, but tur means dry. So it's a place that dries out. And in fact, are they vanishing lakes or are they vanishing fields? And in fact, they're more valuable as fields because when they drain out, there's a lot of grassland, which is very useful for pasture. And that in ancient times would have been even more important when the whole landscape was dense forest and or bogs. Um, they're not unique to Ireland. There's one in Wales, and we've seen several documented in several in Slovenia, and there's also some in Mexico and in Georgia. And so in the world, there's probably more turloughs. They just have different names, just need the right conditions. But in Ireland, they're important habitats, and we've had them listed as priority habitats under the EU Habitats Directive. And as such, then all the turloughs greater than 10 hectares have been designated as special areas of conservation. So they're groundwater fed temporary wetlands in a karst landscape. And that means they occur where pure limestone is near the surface and the rainfall is sufficiently high and the drainage is slow. So they fill when the water input exceeds the outflow. So if it rains a lot, the drainage systems can't cope with the amount of water coming in, and so they back up into the basins and form turloughs. Here is a cross section of a turlough, and you can see here the bedrock is a honeycomb of galleries and in the limestone, and the water then, when it rains, falls down the surface and through these swallow holes and drains out to sea. So that's a normal sort of summertime. But in the wintertime, tends to be less evaporation and the rainfall is higher, and it backs up then again through these swallow holes and it fills up from the basin outwards to a winter flood line, which can be several meters in depth. And that floods into the tree zone if you've got woodland around it, the deciduous trees, and floods the shrub zone. And of course, in the basin, you've got small shrubs and wet grassland and or sedge fen, depending on the conditions of the turlough. And the substrate can be peat or marl or clay. So you have a zonation of plant communities as a function of the flood duration within that basin. So there are over 400 turloughs in Ireland. Here, the Geological Survey of Ireland has mapped them in relation to the limestone, and this is all Carboniferous limestone, but the turloughs are associated with the pure bedded limestone, this pale blue colour. Pure is required so that it dissolves more easily in the slightly acidic rain water. And then bedded in order to provide that bedding, those galleries and conduits that you get in the rock, the drainage and flooding again is facilitated by the bedded limestone. So they're confined mostly to that area, but also it requires at least 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, so annually. So west of this line, we get more than 1,000 millimeters, and this coincides with the turlough distribution. They usually start filling in October and continue and are full after a month or so, and then they start emptying again in April. But they're capricious, and this depends, of course, on the rainfall. So in a really wet year in 2008, even wetter than we've had now, they filled again in the summer. So this is the same turlough in the same month a year later. So this can happen on occasion. Often turloughs are recognizable in winter by the walls running through them. And this is because when they drain out in the summertime, you see that these are actually field systems and they're radiating out from the basin, which in May hasn't fully drained out. And each strip is owned often by a different landowner and managed in a slightly different way. You can see these hawthorn bushes are the same two bushes that are here. So they're quite different landscape depending on the time of year. So as a BSBI, I want to talk a little bit about some of the turlough species. None is unique to turloughs, but they're nationally rare and they're unusual. And one of my favorites is the fen violet, Viola stagnina, which has these very pale blue, almost circular flowers, but it has very long spear-shaped leaves with cordate base, but very long and spear-shaped. And that occurs in the edges of the Turloughs. That was taken in Cool Park, which is shown here. And one of the interesting things about Cool Park is this a national nature reserve, and this area hasn't been grazed for 10, 15 years. So what's keeping the scrub at bay is actually the flood zone. So this floods up in the wintertime through the scrub and up into the trees, but it doesn't last terribly long in that area. And as it drains out, the trees can regrow, but they're held in check by the flooding. The flood duration at this point is too long and it keeps them at bay. The tall herbs likewise will grow here, but again, further down into the basin, you get lower growing herbs. So the fen violet grows on the edge of the tall herb zone because it's not a great competitor, needs light. And on a good year, you can see here again the bitter veg, Vicia cracca. And on the edge of it, you've got a host of fen violet flowers. So it's a really attractive species. But there's also other habitats in the cool zone, and when it really dries out, if it does, in the summertime, it reveals mud because the permanent water levels means that the perennial plants can't really get a hold of the whole area. So you've got a lot of this bare mud, and within the bare mud, you get seeds from annuals. And one of the best ones I like is the mudwort, aptly named Limosella aquatica, protected species. And it has these little rosettes with flowers, but what's really interesting for an annual is it has these stolons with little satellite rosettes of flowers, flowers and leaves. And these flowers have lots of capsules. So each one of these has a set of flowers and capsules and set seed prolifically. And then that seed will remain dormant until the conditions happen again in the following summer, or perhaps in a year or so. So it's a specialist of dry areas, mud areas that dry out at a certain time of the year. So to have a look at the cool mud in a bit more detail, you can see there are lots of annuals that do this. The mudwort here is one of several. Here's just a few others: small water pepper, Persicaria minor, and then just Calitri palustris. Focus on that a bit more. It's been found relatively recently, confirmed for this turlough, one of the first records, confirmed records, Cool Park near Gort in Galway, and it's recognizable by its fruit. And I'm afraid this isn't totally in focus, but if you look at it, the fruit when it dries out and matures becomes even blacker than this. And if you look closely, one of the characteristics is that the wings are towards the top of the fruit, but are absent from the base. And I think it has a straight stigma as well. So it's a mud-dwelling annual with these black fruit, and perhaps it's under-recorded in some of these areas. And any turlough that dries out with mud, it should be looked for. And then finally, just one more specialist of benefiting from the flood zone, very different, a shrub, the shrubby cinquefoil, Potentilla fruticosa, and it's in this area. It's quite common in around the Burren National Park at Mullaghmore here. And it benefits again from the flooding a little bit higher up in the zone, but it requires an open landscape. And it's quite obvious here in another turlough, the far side of the Burren near Ballyvaughan, it grows to quite high amounts. But again, it benefits from the fact that the flood zone keeps the hazel scrub from encroaching, and it will grow very well here. So that's some of the species, but if you want to have a look at the vegetation, because it varies quite a lot, and you have plant communities, and Roger Goodwillie mapped all the turloughs greater than 10 hectares. And just to have a look at a couple, this one here has a basin in the middle, so you've got your circular basin. This is marl, this coloration here is marl, and then surrounding it in this case is Potentilla reptans, creeping cinquefoil community, and then on the outer part, which drain off sooner, you've got wet grassland sedge communities on the edge here. So concentric zones as a function of the duration of the flood, which would be start soonest in the bottom of this turlough. They're not all circular by any means. Here's Carranavudon with the marl again, a pond in the middle. And here, this is Carex niger, the black sedge community. So a different sedge, different community, if you like, and a different shape. But they can be any shape and size, and they are a whole mosaic of complex plant communities. And Roger's drawings are wonderful. There's even buckthorn here, Ramnus community. But just to focus on Peter's Well for another one, you can see it says commons, and several turloughs have got commonage in the middle. The landowners can bring their animals out when it drains out fully, and they will graze in that area. This is another sedge community here. It's not, blue isn't the water. So when that drains out, the animals will be there. But then as it floods again, you can see again these field systems radiating out, each one owned by a different farmer, and the animals can be put into these fields. They'll have access to the water, and then as it floods, they can be moved up into the upper fields, and then eventually when it fills, they're taken away. So this is really important because especially in the times when there wasn't piped water schemes, access to water for animals is really important. And here it is, your free water, if you like, especially in the spring and autumn months, as well as part of the summer. So a key aspect of the turloughs, they've got high biodiversity because they act as refugia, because often they're in a landscape of much more intensively farmed farmed fields and management. And it's low intensity. It has fertilizers, and pesticides are really not that useful because it could be flooded at any time and literally your money is washed away. They're not reseeded because, again, there isn't enough time often to grow arable crops, but they're pasture and they're fertilized by the annual flooding, so they're relatively rich. Usually it's cattle or horses because sheep are more susceptible to liver fruit. And there's a variety then of systems. If you look at the strips of these fields, you can see differences in texture and colour, and no more so than here at Carnavudon again. There's one field which is really tall grass here, and then compared to the neighbouring farmer has shorter grass here. And that's actually really important for invertebrates, as well as a different plant community, because many invertebrates depend on a taller structure, especially marsh flies that like to sit on the tops of the blades of grass and hunt for their prey. So it's not just the pollinators that require a diversity of species, but also a diversity in vegetation structure. So to have a look at Carnavudon, we got money from the Heritage Council to look at the stocking rates and densities. And here we have 6 of the farmers, 6 fields selected. And this is just the time in which the animals were put out throughout the year. And you can see it's also a function of the amount of flooding. So the ones that are flooded more often, the animals are put out a bit later. And then there's one farmer who puts out cattle just for 2, or animals, cattle, I think, just for 2 weeks, and that he has a really high density. And so that is actually the field which has the tall grass. The photo was taken in July. And that's it gives a diversity. You've got different structure, different plant communities, and it's important. So these fields vary in their management and in their communities. But we also studied Carraglasson. And here you can see how many different ways in which you can put your animals out. There's a whole combination of different things. So each one of these fields is managed differently. And I think that's really important to stress. And there was one, again, which had a high density for 4 weeks, slightly lower than the one above, but still there's a different one there. So the farming practices can vary between both fields and individual turloughs, resulting in very diverse ecosystems. So in other words, you've got the flood zones creating different plant communities, but then across those flood zones, depending on the management, you have different plant communities. And should the farmers abandon the use of their turlough, then the biodiversity would decrease. It's really important to stress that because rewilding has its place. But here, I think low intensity farming and the variety of farming management, even if it's quite subtle, really benefits not just the plant communities, but the wildlife, the invertebrates, and in this case, vertebrates, lots of hares in this low intensity farmed turlough edge. So that's my message. Thanks very much for listening. And here's my email. And hopefully you enjoyed the talk.